Another function of the Terrain Toolkit is to allow for the procedural placement of textures on the surfaces of your terrain based on a series of predefined factors such as slope and altitude.
Right. This is a very fast way to get in textures without having to hand paint each one.
Now, before we really get into how it works, I want to jot down some notes. So I've got out Mr. Whiteboard here, or, okay, Mr. Blue Board, or whatever color you like. I've got my drawing board here. And let's take a cross-section of a piece of terrain. So let's say this is what I want my terrain to look like, just in this example. Now, the Terrain Toolkit allows you to bring in a total of 6 textures. The first of these is a cliff texture. And the other 5 are altitude textures. Or they can be placed based on altitude anyway, for a total of 6. Now, here's how this works. The cliff texture is going to be applied to your terrain based on a predetermined slope. You can control not only at what slope the cliff should be exposed, but also how you're going to blend over changes in slope, so how harshly it's going to appear. I'll get to that in just a moment, but first let's take a look at a cross-section of our terrain, and I'm going to divide it up into 5 sections. Now these are sections based on altitude. There's 3, and then 4 and 5. At our lowest altitude, we'll get texture 1. At our second altitude, we'll get texture 2, then texture 3, then texture 4, and then finally at the top, we'll get texture 5. We're limited here. We can't have a 6th texture. We're only allowed up to 5 of these. You don't have to have 5 of these, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But anywhere that our slope falls within the predetermined slope value, all of these will be overridden by our cliff texture. So that's kind of how this is going to work. Now, what I'd like to do in Unity is go ahead and bring in our textures so that we can set up our slope and our various altitudes in the upcoming videos. So let's jump back over to Unity. Now, currently over here inside the Terrain Toolkit, we're getting a whole bunch of red warnings that says no textures have been assigned. Assign a texture. So as soon as I click Assign a Texture, we get our base cliff texture. And of course, this is just a stand-in. Naturally, you wouldn't want to leave a gigantic checkerboard, which is trying to remind you to add a texture. But I'll click on the Select button. And let's grab Cliff Layered Rock. And that's where we'll start. And this will get applied, for now, everywhere. Now I'm going to go ahead and add the remaining textures. So I'll go ahead and click Add. And I'll do this 4 more times. So 2, 3, 4, and 5. Notice as soon as I do that, the Add Texture button goes away. Now, I'm going to add these textures, starting at texture 1 all the way up to texture 5, considering how I would want my elevations to be separated. So what would I want on the lowest possible level? If we were considering this maybe to be something rising up out of the ocean, it might make sense for this to be like beach sand. So let's grab texture 1, and I'm going to click the little circular load button. In Unity 3, at the time of this writing, this part of the UI looks a little weird. It used to look a lot nicer back in the Unity 2.6 days, but it's not entirely functional right now. Everything you need is here, it just doesn't look as good. You don't have your little texture swatches. So if we click on the little tiny load circle for texture 1, let's drag down underneath sand, and there's our nice bright beach sand. So we'll start there.
Something to notice, when we first added the very first cliff texture, it got applied automatically. As Zach continues to add textures, notice that they are not being added to our terrain.
That's right. We're going to have to adjust some settings, and then we'll have to click Apply Procedural Texture, which is something we'll take a look at just a little bit later. Now, next I'm going to take Texture 2, which is this load button here, right about the middle of the inspector, about halfway across on top. And let's grab a nice grassy texture. We'll do Grass Hill. That looks kind of nice. So we go from sand to grass. Now we can go to maybe some sparser grass. So we've got like grass and rock, which we'll switch up to. Then for texture 4, we'll switch up to just some rocks. And let's see, we've got our other layered rock. We're using the this brownish one, so let's switch over to this greenish one. And then for texture number 5, we'll actually throw some snow on top. So if we scroll down, there's some snow. So now we have all 5 of our textures assigned, starting with our cliff texture, which is a rock. Then we go from sand to grass to sparse grass to rock and then to snow. So but I'm not even going to worry about settings right now. Let me jump back over to our notes. So starting at the base, and that's some focus issues, we start off with sand, then we have our grass, then we have, I'm going to abbreviate this, so sparse grass will just become S-grass. Then we go to rock, and then finally at the cap we have snow. But as we're going to soon see, anywhere that we have an extreme slope, which obviously on our great big plateau we got a lot of areas of some pretty extreme slope, we're going to be seeing our cliff texture. And that's what we're going to look at in the next couple of videos. However, since we've now assigned all of our textures, that's going to wrap everything up for this video. Thanks a lot.